There's something that I really attribute the Neubie to expediting my recovery is the activation of my gastroc. I can't tell you exactly timeline of when it happened, but I remember the first time I fired my gastroc after surgery because my soleus was strong enough to overcome most of what I needed early on. That it was when I had the Neubie on and I felt the gastroc fire, and then the neuromuscular connection clicked. It was like, okay, I can fire it now. So
Nice.
being able to reestablish that neuromuscular connection, the firing pattern, like you don't realize how much of a factor that plays into your rehab and recovery as well. It's like if you don't know what it feels like to fire the muscle appropriately, then you can't really fire it. So once you feel it turning on, then you can kind of remember that and recreate it.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Hello, NeuFit Nation. Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast. I'm joined today by Luke Brohm, Doctor of Physical Therapy, and a guy that I have had the privilege of knowing now for nearly 3 years. We met at the first NeuFit training at CORT, that's K-O-R-T, Kentucky Orthopedic Rehab Team, up in Louisville, Kentucky. And he's the clinic director in their Shepherdsville location, which nationally we can think about it as a suburb of Louisville, but locally there, it's a different county. So as Luke told me, they like to differentiate that. So
yes, they do.
So Luke also, in addition to being a clinic director and one of the leaders within this really wonderful organization, is also trained both, of course, in NeuFit and in the hands-on diagnostics and MSK ultrasound and electrodiagnostics, EMG and nerve conduction studies, doing all of that work, which we've talked about at different times on this podcast before with other guests who are doing those types of diagnostic services in there. So he's a very skilled diagnostician and an excellent clinician. I've gotten to know him over the last few years. Really excited to have Luke on today specifically to talk about all things Achilles tendon, because he has some deep expertise here from working with patients, everything he's learned. And then he and I both have our own personal Achilles rehabilitation stories to share as well. So we are going to go into all things Achilles tendon. Luke, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Heck yeah. So let's talk first about your backstory. Give people a sense of who you are. What's your origin story getting into physical therapy?
Well, I mean, it really starts back when I was around 7. I went to a PT clinic with my sister, and I remember walking in. They had like a walking track around, and I remember seeing like some of the exercise bikes and some of the exercise balls, the physio balls. And I remember leaving thinking like, oh, this is what I want to do for a living. These people don't work. I was wrong. We do work. We work very hard. But it was a catalyst to kind of get me in that. I've always been an active person and involved in sports and athletics, had my own history of injuries. But I was interested in physical therapy before I had my injury. So every one of my injuries I kind of used as a learning process to become a better physical therapist. So some of them were kind of catalysts to expedite my learning and help me through some of the process. I had a really bad disc herniation, L5S1, when I was in PT school. And that probably taught me more about being a therapist and relating to people and having empathy and guiding them through a course of care than anything I learned in school. And then when I was in college, I tore my meniscus and went through a recovery while I was playing football. So I had that whole experience from a knee rehab. So having those experiences prior to school really helped me, because during school, your clinicals are 12 weeks at the most. So you don't really get to see anybody through a course of care when they have a longer term injury. And so that kind of led me into my PT journey. And then when I was in college, I did a lot of work as a physical therapy technician for CORT and saw all of the great continuing education opportunities that we offer, like our orthopedic residency program. And all of the best therapists that I worked with went through that. So that was always a goal getting out of school. And then I graduated, started working, did the orthopedic residency, got my OCS, and kind of thought I had made it. I'd become a clinical director. And then all of a sudden, our president, Robbie, dropped on this ball and told me to participate in the hands-on diagnostic program through the EMG and ultrasound, which I kind of thought I'd never do another residency. But I'm glad I did, because it brought me to this point and really expedited my learning and allowed me to help so many people along the way.
That's awesome. I remember we chatted, just it'd be fun to hear your perspective on it now looking back. But I remember we chatted after the NeuFit training, initial one we had done together with that small pilot group in Louisville a few years ago. And I remember you had said you were a little skeptical about NeuFit at first, and then you sort of changed your mind. Can you just tell us about your first impressions and that initial experience too?
I mean, when Ravi first brought up the NeuFit pilot training program, kind of like nonchalantly mentioned it, and I was like, well, I trust you, I'll go do it. But like, I was very skeptical. I was like, I barely use electrical stim as it is, just mainly for post-operative NMES strength training, Russian. And I was like, I'll go. And I kept an open mind, but I was not convinced that it was going to work. And then after we left, I was like, all right, I'm fully bought in on just the first day of using it. And I mean, giving me 3 years of clinical experience with it, I don't know how I could practice without it at this point. I mean, you could, but I had a clinician that came here and worked for me for about a year before he moved back home. And he was moving to a clinic that didn't have a Neubie. And he was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've been using this thing for a year. But when he was a student of mine, I would pick days. I was like, all right, you cannot use the Neubie today. You have to learn how to be a clinician today. You're not allowed to touch it. And then I'd let him use it for days so that he'd have to figure out how to fix things when he didn't have access to a Neubie.
That's funny. I had not heard that. That's really funny. That's really funny. All right. So thank you for sharing that. Let's now segue into our intended topic of the day, Achilles tendon injuries. So it seems like there's an epidemic in the NFL, in the NBA. There's all these high profile players who are having Achilles tendon ruptures. And I know you've thought about it. I've thought about it. We've talked about it. What's emerged for you as your best understanding of why they're happening? I mean, first of all, are Achilles tendon injuries actually becoming more common, or is it just that we're paying more attention, we hear more in the news? And also, if it is more common, what's the cause, what's the mechanisms, et cetera? So what's your latest thinking on all of that?
Well, I'll give you just a quick backstory on how I tore mine. I tore mine while I was playing basketball, and I consider myself fairly fit, never have any issues playing basketball, didn't have any pain with my Achilles at all playing. But prior to, I had really been lacking in sleep and recovery with just being a parent in life. I mean, my Oura ring metrics were significantly lower than they had been, my readiness level and my heart rate variability. So I know that I was under recovered. And then the day before, we went to a trampoline park with the kids for a birthday party. And there were no other kids there except for our kids in the birthday party. So the dads that were there had their own birthday party. So I probably spent 2 hours jumping on professional level trampolines. And then that night went over to a friend's house. I think I only had one bourbon. Don't really drink that much anymore. And then, that's of course affects your sleep. So I think I maybe slept 6 hours and then went and played basketball without really warming up. So it was kind of a catalyst of all different events. But I think really that sharp increase in load as well as under recovery. So I think with basketball players, and I could be wrong on some of this, but I think a lot of it, if I'm correct, there is a component where they had some kind of injury before and then they were out and then they come back to the same load that they were at. So they weren't necessarily tolerated for the level of load that they had. So a sharp increase in load on the tendon.
Yeah.
And then I also think there's the bias effect of us being more aware of it. It's a hot topic, social media, things kind of go on a trend. Achilles injuries are good hooks because you see that video and you see the Achilles snap. So it's such a visual hook on social media that I think that plays a role in our perception or bias of how much it's present. And then I would follow up with a question. I don't know if you saw that research, but I wouldn't necessarily call it research. It was an article on X. So we got to take that with a grain of salt. But how the San Francisco 49er players have a higher injury rate and they think that electrical substation is next door. So I don't know if there is a component of some of the increase in exposure to 5G, which, I mean, I guess that's a hot topic word, but I think that's something that's at least worth looking into.
Mm-hmm. And I heard it explained as there can be a proposed mechanism if there's greater amounts of EMFs, and that can disrupt, of course, electrochemical signaling, right? If there's an electric field, that can influence some processes in the body, and that could be relevant to collagen remodeling. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean,
anecdotally, they put in a T-Mobile next door to us about 6 months ago. So, or maybe a little bit more than that, but probably 2 to 3 months before I had my injury. I mean, that's, I would have never thought about that had I not read some of those things before, but
interesting.
I don't attribute that to my injury at all. I think it's just a concept that might be worth looking into more.
Yeah. And I've read a little bit about that, and I think with EMFs generally, I don't think anyone can prove, or that I could sit here and confidently say it's a one-to-one cause, that this 5G and EMF influence caused this. But I do think that there is, between EMFs and air pollution and water quality, that there's overall environmental burdens, and also the amount of time that we're on our phones and difficulty unplugging and all this. I think the overall environmental burden is higher. And it's interesting when you talk about your story about how it was this accumulation of nights of poor sleep plus activity the day before, plus having one drink the night before, all that. It's interesting. When I had my injury, so you ruptured your Achilles, we'll talk more about that, and had to have surgery. I had a tear in mine, as visualized on MSK ultrasound, that has since healed into a tendinopathy, where it's thickened, but there's no visible tearing. So it's making progress. We'll talk about my progression as well. One interesting commonality, though, is that the day that I did mine, I was working on a vertical jump program. I was going up. I had this basketball hoop that I could adjust from like 9 foot, 9.5, 10. I was working on trying to touch a 10-foot rim, trying to get my vertical jump up there. And so I went. I think it was the first jump of the day. I had warmed up, but went to the jump and I just felt a little twinge in my Achilles. And the reason I mentioned this is that day I was going through that week, I was going through a very difficult time in my life personally. And I was related to separation from my wife and just a lot of sadness. And I was emotionally drained. And I was not in a state where, in retrospect, I should have been working out that day. I just thought, it's my jumping day. I'm going to do this, and once I warm up, I'll be fine. But I really was drained. I know there's no way that my neuromuscular system was able to coordinate force and precision, intermuscular and intramuscular coordination at the peak of its capability. And so I just know that had something to do with it. And then there's also, like you use previous injuries. I mean, with Tyrese Halliburton, with Kevin Durant, when they had their Achilles tears, they were just coming off these calf injuries. So there's issues with their mechanics, incomplete rehabilitation of the calf muscle, which of course is literally becomes the Achilles, muscle. So there's that. And then I think it's all this load of, people layering fitness on top of dysfunction, as Gray Cook says, not building the requisite movement proficiency, and then just not being able to fully recover in this world of artificial light and not as much downtime and all that. I think it's kind of a perfect storm of all. And then of course you have the fluoroquinolone, the antibiotics or steroid injections. Sometimes it's that. One thing, just to add in the discussion, one thing that I didn't really realize until I was just doing some more research, reading up to this episode, is that dysregulated blood sugar can actually make tendons more stiff and brittle, because so blood sugar makes these AGEs. It's these glycated end products. So when there's excess blood sugar, these glycated end products, it's sort of like it's like the burnt ends on meat if you're barbecuing meat or something like that. So it's that's a similar chemical process of glycation. So it makes actually tissues can be more stiff and brittle. So it's like a perfect storm of all these different things. All the things that make us more or less healthy also make our tissues more or less healthy. So it's just, there's a lot of overlap with the things we would talk about for general lifestyle and health too. So I think it's probably all of it.
And I think one thing that we do, especially as we age, I'm only 33, so I still, think that I'm 23, and I think probably at 40, you probably still think that you're 23. So I try not to look at my Oura Ring metrics too much, because if I do, it kind of stresses me out. But what I try to do is, and I didn't do it then, I started to ignore them too much. But if I know I'm going to work out hard that day, I kind of look at the previous trends. Like, hey, how have I been? How have I been doing, especially since this injury? So I know, hey, I can push myself more, or it's basically a threshold or marker for I know how hard I can push that day. Because I like to push myself to, end range, to fatigue, to see what I can do. Mainly mentally, it helps me feel better, but also to be in a good physical shape. So I think as we age, it's really important to know that we can't push ourselves to max, especially if we take 2 weeks off for vacation, you fall out of it, because your body might still be able to lift the weight that you could lift before, but you haven't tolerated or loaded the tissue to accept that load that you're now overloading it with. Sorry, that might have been a little bit of a tongue tie, but I think you get the picture of what I'm saying is those long breaks off and then coming back. Because I think one of the biggest injuries in running is you take time off and you go back and you ran what you ran before. Is like with long distance runners, if they can run 13 miles, they might take a month off and they could still run 13 miles, but they're more likely to get injured doing that versus progressively working their way up.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating bodies of research that I've ever come across is looking at how quickly tissue atrophy sets in when someone is sedentary, lying in a hospital bed, for example. And it just speaks to this notion of conservation of energy. If we're not loading tissues, it's metabolically expensive to maintain certainly muscle, tendon, even more nerve tissue. So it's very metabolically costly. And if we're not loading that tissue, even for a day, the body will start to break down some of that because it doesn't want to spend the extra energy and resources to maintain that. So if we're, this is not saying never take a day off or never have a lighter day, but there is something to be said, for a lighter day being, hey, I'm still walking, I'm still getting my 8 or 10 or 12,000 steps in, even though I'm not working out hard today. So you can maintain that tissue quality as opposed to literally just sitting on the couch all day. When even that will start to downregulate a little bit. And if you're being extremely sedentary for a couple of weeks, yeah, like you just said, Luke, when someone comes back from that, it can be enough to set you up for not being able to do as much as previously. So you told us a little bit about your injury playing basketball. Can you walk us through now your rehabilitation progression? So, from the day the injury happened, when did you get the surgery? And then talk us through now. I believe we're approximately 4 months out. So can we just, kind of go through step by step your progression? Because I think there's going to be some good pearls along the way there that extrapolate out. Plus, it's a good story.
So I will tell you, right after it happened, I think I did my 5 stages of grief in probably 5 minutes. I think I spent a minute in each stage. I had the immediate fear of like, oh my God, what's going on? Or denial, like, I didn't hurt this. It's just a calf injury. I'll be okay. And then getting up and can't walk. It's like, okay, well, there's definitely an Achilles component, but it's not fully torn. Just sitting on the bench of the game and just thinking like, I think I immediately pulled my phone out and made a TikTok. Like, here we go. We're going on a journey. And then from that point, I think it really speaks to the importance of being prepared for what is to come. So since I've been through this with other people and having had a surgery in my past, it's like, okay, the first fear is checked off. I'm not going to die. I mean, that is a facetious claim, but it really is important because it allows you to downregulate the autonomic nervous system of the threat. So I'm able to kind of take things as they come and pay more attention to what's going on. So learning to process the injury very early on when it is a major injury, I think is really important. Although I still had a little bit of denial trying to think it was a partial tear and not a full tear until I went to one of my buddies that does the ultrasound imaging. Shout out to Chris Disler. And he confirmed it was fully torn. He was like, yeah, that's fully torn. You're not. And so getting set up, thankfully I'm in a good system locally where I have a lot of connections. I was able to get in with a really good orthopedic surgeon. Within, I think I had the injury on Sunday. I got in to him the next day, and then I had surgery by Friday. I'd never really thought about a non-operative rehab from Achilles repair. He had mentioned it to me in my meeting or like in my assessment with him. And he was like, it's a possibility. But then we kind of talked through all the different components of the fact that I want to get back to sports. I lift a lot of weights. I've got young kids at home that I think for me and where I was in life, that the surgical option was the best option. And so I think within a week I had surgery. And during that week, I stayed active. I was doing cross training on my other leg, trying to do what I could on my surgical leg. And then immediately after surgery, I take the first day off, but then I got into hip mobility, making sure my core was strong, cross training with my left leg, as well as keeping my upper body strong and doing what cardio I could. I have a little tent sauna from Sauna Box at home with the infrared. And because I was in a cast, he told me I wasn't allowed to sweat, but I would get in there and go just to the point of sweating, just to try to get my heart rate up. And then I'd back off, I'd get out, and then I'd do that a round or two while I was off work, and I had plenty of time to do those things. But keeping myself active was very integral in my mental health. I participated in as much as I could with my family. I tried to toe the balance between accepting help but not relying on help, doing what I could do. I would help with the dishes. I'd go stand up for 10 minutes, and I'd just tell my wife, I'd be like, look, I got to go sit down. I can't help anymore. And so she was very supportive throughout that process, having an amazing support system at home. And I would have family come over and help with the kids or send the kids off to somebody's house in those early phases of recovery, so that I was able to focus on what I needed to do to get myself back into a proper position. So I attribute a lot of the early recovery, because I couldn't use the Neubie in those first 4 weeks because I had a cast on. Otherwise, I would have been. But I attribute a lot of the early recovery to mindset, cross training, and staying active, and then participating in life as much as I could. Just trying to live as much of a normal life as possible and not letting this stop my life completely.
Did you do any plantar dorsiflexion isometrics inside your calf inside your cast?
I was, yes. I was trying to do whatever activations I could. So, kind of like essentially, I think I was about 20 to 30 degrees plantar flexed, but doing some isometric dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, eversion while I was in the cast.
Yeah, that's good, because that's a signal, as we'll talk about. Tendons, all tissues, tendons especially, respond to mechanical signaling, and so that isometric that you're doing there is actually literally helping to trigger the remodeling process. So instead of having the random oriented scar tissue, you're getting your collagen remodeling along those lines of force. So a little editorializing along the way here, but is very helpful.
And also, like, you don't realize from like a perspective of developing chronic regional pain syndrome, having a nerve block and being in a cast, not touching it. Like, I was knocking on my cast, I was touching my toes, I was doing whatever I could to get any kind of impulse and sensory input into the foot outside of the motor activations to make sure I kept that area active, so that when I came out of the cast, I wouldn't be sensitive to it. Because I can tell you, I've never really been a sensitive to touch person, but after I tore it, I had one of my other therapists working on it in the clinic, using the glove to kind of calm it down. And I couldn't bear them to even just barely touch my Achilles. I would like jump off the table.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, I got to make sure that that's not still present afterwards. So, and then as soon as I got the cast off, I was touching it every day. I would try to get down there and do some soft tissue mobilizations, working on the actual soleus and gastroc themselves, but then just kind of running my finger along the scar and along the tendon itself. So the mechanical input from a manual therapy standpoint as well, I think, was super important. And then including in proper nutrition. So making sure that I prioritize protein, supplemental collagen, I think, has some different opinions if you read different things on the actual benefits, but I figured in a case like this, it's not going to hurt to have supplemental collagen. And then, like we talked about earlier, the taking vitamin C and zinc in my recovery, making sure I had my vitamin D. And I think those were the main supplements that I was using during the time. So making sure you have the proper nutrition so that you can actually get the energy and the cellular components down to the level so that it can heal. And then from there, I think around 3 weeks, I got my cast off and was in my boot. And I was actually allowed, per my surgeon's guidelines, to start weight bearing in the boot. But I was very cautious about not overloading it initially and using a progressive load tolerance each day, kind of increasing my load with my crutches, weaning from 2 crutches down to 1 crutch, really working on that walking capacity, walking endurance, and building up my load tolerance for weight bearing. but I also would use the scooter. So I'd use the scooter and I'd go out for almost like cardio on the scooter. I'd take the scooter out and I'd go just to have that forward movement out in nature. I mean, as much of a neighborhood can be. And then I had I walk free. I don't know if you've seen those, the knee crutches. It's like a pirate peg leg.
Yeah.
So I would use that in the house. And so I would switch back and forth between the crutches, the scooter, and the iWalk, depending on what I was doing and in what situation. Again, a lot of it was to maintain participation in life as much as possible, but also to keep me independent and keep me up and moving. And then during that phase, I was actually using the Neubie a lot to try to get input into the calf and get everything activated and loaded. So that kind of takes me through the next like 3 weeks there. Also, a lot of cross training, a lot more cardio since I could sweat at that point. And I could tell you right after the cardio, I don't know, have you ever had a surgery?
I had an orthopedic surgery on my hip for bone spurs for FAI. So I got the bone shaved down in the neck of my femur, labrum repair. So yeah, I've been through that. It's a whole other story, but great outcome.
But so, like when the inflammation really peaks and you get that kind of swelling and throbbing down in the foot, that happens a lot after an Achilles surgery. And as soon as I would do cardio, you could feel the pressure relief because, I mean, with it being a distal body part and gravity, everything's going to pull down to the foot. So having to have that muscle pump, you don't get the muscle pump of the calf. I mean, some people call it calf the second heart, but you don't get that muscle pump when you're not loading it. So using cardio to kind of help flush that foot out was tremendously beneficial. Really helps for blood clots early on as well. And then from there we go into kind of the full weight bearing stage. I think by about 5 weeks I was full weight bearing, but I wouldn't be full weight bearing all the time. I would make sure that I would use my crutches still because I didn't want to overload it and I wanted to make sure I kept my pain under control. But I would still work out with my boot on. I was even doing some small range squats with weight because I knew that if my foot's isolated or restricted from motion in the boot, I know I'm not going to overload the Achilles. So being smart about how I load my legs to keep the load off the Achilles, but to try to keep my leg as strong as I could. That was super beneficial. But then also I think it was a very unique experience we talked a little bit about on Instagram. I took my kids to the creek because it's one of our favorite things to do. And I took my boot off and I kind of walked through the creek. I mean, I was hobbling on a stick, but having my foot in the water at that early phase and kind of in some of the mud and rock was a little bit uncomfortable, but it gave me a very similar sensation to when I did the foot bath. So a Neubie foot bath. I don't know the direct science behind that, but we can talk about grounding and some of the benefits that come with that. But having my foot in it is different than having my foot in like the shower or the bathtub. Having it in the water with all the different sensory inputs in a cold water gave me a very similar sensation to the Neubie. So I think from an anecdotal standpoint, a non-scientific standpoint, it goes to show you how beneficial the foot bath is to kind of create that normal sensory environment of the foot. Because, I mean, if you have an electrical current running through your foot, you're still going to activate all those nerves that are coming down. So exactly. I think with that somatosensory input, I think that was very beneficial.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the Neubie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.neu.fit. That's neu.fit. So you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there.
That's cool. Yeah, that's great. And I can imagine, especially when you talked about how sensitive, especially the tendon was after being in the boot and all that you are just getting that barrage of input from the different surface on the bottom of the foot and the running water and the temperature. You're hitting a lot of different sensory receptors. And when you're using the Neubie foot bath, that water is the dispersive medium, and it's sending that electrical current through all the different mechanoreceptor, afferent pathways there. So you're stimulating just this whole barrage. So it probably is the closest thing because you're just getting that shotgun rather than rifle approach of just getting all the different receptors and afferent pathways. So that's cool. I can see how that would be very healing to kind of be in that environment also. That's cool.
Well, and they talk about Mother Nature being healing. So, I mean, the older I get, the more I like to spend time out in nature. And I think that is a healing components in our life. And that might be part of the thing that we're missing with being on screens and on our phones too much. We're too overstimulated and not involved in our natural environment enough.
Yeah.
But from there, we go into, we get into like the 3-month mark where I can start actually loading my Achilles more. I can start doing some calf raises. And I'll be honest, from my standpoint, that's where I kind of started to stall out a little bit on my own, just getting back into life. Now I'm back to work and trying to figure out my schedules with 3 young kids, getting kids to school, making it through a work day, and then still having time to try to do some isolated rehab. During that phase, I did a lot of really my normal routine, because my normal fitness routine is kind of oriented around rehab. I talk about being strong for life, but also being pain-free. So I really am only lifting 2 or 3 days a week, and I try to do yoga 1 to 2 days a week. So in that phase, doing yoga was very helpful because it forces you to be open chain and closed chain through the full range of motion of the ankle, but also all of your other joints. In addition to working your balance in different, positions, if whether you're in a warrior or single leg stance, and you got your frontal plane and sagittal plane stability, and you're working all of those in yoga position. So yoga was super beneficial to regain the balance. But I can tell you in that phase, I definitely underloaded my gastroc, from a sense that I think I could be even further along had I spent a little bit more isolated time. And I actually didn't use the Neubie as much in that time, just because, again, excuses that come up with life. But now that I'm getting back into using the Neubie more, we're a little over 4 months. And I can tell you, and I talked to Josh Bixler about this, but it's right around the 4-month mark that you really start to get that stretch shortening cycle back of the Achilles. The tendon starts to really be able to tolerate that heavier load pattern with that. So you could kind of feel like I felt like I had a little more pep in my step. I felt basically around 4 months, pretty much normal for everyday activities. In that 3-month phase, I could do all of my daily activities, but there was a lot more struggle. Like even I would do a lot of barefoot walking, like just walking down the street to a neighbor's house with the kids. I had to really think about like my gait pattern and making sure I'm not compensating with my toe flexors. Now around 4 months is when I really started to regain that normal walking pattern. The Achilles was able to tolerate a little bit more load, and I started to get back into really the main plyometric phase, and that is just the little pogos where you're doing the small bouncing assisted. Now we're really starting to push it.
Awesome.
So that kind of walks us up to this point of my rehab. I hope that was succinct enough.
Yeah, very good. It's great to hear about the different phases and stages there, and it's, from what we've talked about now and in prior conversations, it seems like you're about as far along as someone can be, unless it's the Aaron Rodgers or who's literally spending hours and hours a day doing this. But for someone who has a day job and all that, I think it's about as far along as we could reasonably expect it to be here. Certainly ahead of average, and it seems like you're doing a great job and doing everything diligently.
And I would add one little anecdote. Throughout that whole time, there would be definite days where I would get frustrated. Like, let's say I'm going down the steps and my leg's giving out because I don't have the strength for the eccentric load down the steps. But then I would immediately remind myself, I couldn't do this last week. I am progressing, like really reshifting and reframing everything towards the positive of like what I can do versus what I can't do. I think that mental aspect alone has made this recovery seem so much better than it could have been, because I could definitely be down in the dumps of like, I can't run, I can't play basketball. Like there's still a lot of things that I can't do, or I could hurt myself, I could re-injure myself doing. But really focusing on the positive has been immensely impactful, but also helped me so much more from an empathetic side when somebody's going through recovery, trying to reframe their perspective to get them out of the dumps and back on the right track. And that mindset, I think, plays a huge role in our ability to recover.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big part of it. And that's a big part of your, as a therapist working with patients, having that perspective and relationship. And a lot of it is that sort of coaching and helping cultivate that mindset within your patients there. And when I think about my experience recovering now 5 years ago from my hip surgery, the early stages, I think I had a advantage because I had the Neubie at home with me, and I used it. I had it on almost 24 hours. I had it on probably 20 hours a day. I had it on while I was asleep. I had it on at regular settings. I had it on at frequency specific microcurrent settings. And I didn't take any pain meds at all. I didn't need them. I just had it on. It just managed everything so effectively for me. And at the 9-day mark, I went, I ended up doing my rehab with our team, but I also went along the way to check in just out of curiosity, figured I'd learned something, went and checked in with the physical therapist who worked for the orthopedic surgeon who I know and like and all that. So I went 9 days after surgery. I had the Neubie on at home, and I lay down at the table and he's lifting my leg up and down. He's like, dang, I have never seen someone's leg move like this 9 days after hip surgery. Then he goes, tell me about this Neubie thing. And so
Yeah.
he started using it and all that, but it was really fascinating. So that's one thing that, had there been an opportunity to do that in the immediate aftermath, I think it could have been really helpful there. It was for me. And then anecdotally, we have some athletes or individuals that get to, bring devices home for a post-op acute stuff like that too, where that can be helpful. So,
well, I will tell you, there were several days, probably, around week 3 when I got my boot off to week 6 when I returned to work. My wife's cousin works at a physical therapy clinic for court right down the street from my house, and they have a Neubie. So I would call her and be like, hey, I'm going to come up there at lunch and use the Neubie. Or I even had her let me in on the weekend one day. I was like, I need to use this thing because there was a couple times where the pain would kind of get a little bit higher, and I would just go in and use that and boom, take it right away.
Nice. Oh, that's cool. Very good. Very good. So let's talk a little bit more about. Actually, I'll share my Achilles tendon story here too, since you have shared yours in great detail there. So I'll share mine. So I mentioned the beginning where I had this similar perfect storm of different variables, and that day that I felt that initial tweak, I kept training that day, and then I stayed with my routine for many months, and it just progressively got a tiny bit worse, almost imperceptibly. And then eventually, after months of, I love being able to sprint once a week. That's just sort of my standard, something that I love to do. It's a good check-in with where I am physically. So I would continue doing that. I was doing that. I was doing that and this jump routine. My Achilles kept just getting a little bit worse. So I cut out the jumping for a little bit. I kept sprinting, and then it just kind of crossed one day. It's almost like, it's like if you walk towards the Grand Canyon, you don't fall in, and then you're at the edge of the canyon, and then your next step you fall in, right? But each step actually brought you closer to it. So I finally just sort of crossed that threshold where I was like, this is bothering me. I need to switch into rehab mode. And so I started rehabbing it, of course, using the Neubie, working on calf musculature, sleeping with it on at night. I would bring it home and have it on to increase blood flow to the tendon. And then I did a lot of this research. I listened to, I'll give a shout out to the Keith Baar, BAAR podcast episode on Tim Ferriss's show, where he talks a lot about tendon health and isometric training. So I've been doing a lot of that, so far this year for several months. And the way he describes isometrics is very interesting. So let's do a little aside on this mechanism here, where he talks about, well, first of all, if we're bouncing, if we're running, jumping, bouncing, doing those type of quick reactive loading, there's what's called stress shielding will happen in the tendon, where the stronger parts, the tendon, like muscle, is think of a cylinder with a bunch of different columns or fibers in it, all running parallel to each other, and there can be stronger and weaker fibers in there, or portions of collagen. And if you load quickly, stress shielding means that the stronger parts will absorb that force and the weaker parts will be shielded, so you don't really load them. Whereas if you do something like an isometric, he on Tim Ferriss' podcast, he used this metaphor. He's like, imagine that I was doing tug of war on the same team as the Rock. So if we're pulling initially, the Rock might be pulling 800 pounds and I might be pulling 200 pounds. And so it's basically all him. That's sort of like stress shielding. But over time, as he fatigues, he may drop down in weight if he's doesn't have as much endurance. But then all of a sudden I'm contributing more. If he's only contributing 300 pounds, my 200 pounds that I'm able to maintain makes a lot more. So So if you load isometrically over, 30, 45, 60 seconds, then you're going to be able to stimulate all parts of the tendon, including the more vulnerable ones. So I started doing a lot of that this year, isometric loading, working into heavier loading, then introducing some hops, and was making great progress. And then all of a sudden I had a little bit of a setback, and I was like, gosh, what's going on? And I've realized I've been playing a lot of golf lately, which I love, and which is a whole other podcast episode. And I realized that golf, not from walking, because I would walk even on days I'm not playing, but the golf swing was actually re-aggravating and irritating my Achilles. And I'm thinking, but I don't plantar flex and dorsiflex, right? I'm not sprinting, I'm not absorbing a lot of force, but it's that rotation through the calcaneus, and that torque into the Achilles was actually the thing that was sort of setting me back. So that's something that I've learned about and had to manage. And then also just learning how long it does take for tendons to remodel, especially if you do something like I was, to re-aggravate them along the way. But that combination of the isometrics and then just heavy bent knee and straight knee calf raises, isometrics at different angles, and then working in more of the hopping and progression there, has been a good recipe. When I realized that, I woke up the morning after going and playing golf, and I was like, my Achilles has been feeling great the last week, and why is it hurting today? And it just hit me, and I was like, oh shit. It was just like such a sinking feeling. But that it was, good learning along the way there. So
that's what you said. So early on in my recovery, I did a lot of isometrics. I did a lot of overcoming isometrics.
Yeah.
Which I actually surprisingly didn't know about beforehand. But essentially putting a weight that you can't lift and then trying to load through that so that you have the stimulus through the Achilles that you're trying to drive more, so you get that increased neuromuscular recruitment.
Yeah.
But what you're thinking with the stress shielding, that makes sense with a lot of the injuries in like basketball players, because how many of them are actually taking time to do isolated isometrics during their season? I'm sure if they've got a really good rehab coach, they are, but they're going back from an injury without really doing that isometric. So they have those portions of the tendon that have been tolerating more force. So then you take that same load because you got all that excess force going when you're in that drop step position, because so many of them are in the drop step position, and then you load those tendons. So that could be part of the mechanism of injury with the Achilles tendon tears. Yeah,
for sure. Ultimately it's, my background in physics and engineering, it's a question of tissue capacity. What is the capacity of that tissue? How many newtons of force can it handle before it breaks? And if you have 100 fibers that can each handle 10 newtons, just for easy numbers, that's 1,000 newtons of force. And if out of those 100 fibers, 40 of them are offline, now you can only handle 600 newtons instead of 1,000. And eventually if you don't load as much of the tendon, it becomes less and less, just like you said, so less and less capable of handling and withstanding that. So that probably is a good part of it. It's that gradual weakening over time until eventually the capacity reduces, and then the load exceeds, that's the word I was looking for, exceeds the capacity. So
and that kind of makes sense with my injury. I do, my leg days, I never really included any isolated Achilles stuff because I wasn't really playing plyometric sports anymore. Other than some men's league basketball. So my quads and glutes, I would consider very strong relative to my Achilles. So now I know that I got to keep in my Achilles rehab once I get back to all of my normal routines, so that my legs aren't disproportionately strong above the Achilles.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of these things where when I think about using the Neubie specifically, it's kind of interesting. It's, in transparency, in some ways it's a little disappointing because we're so used to having these outcomes where someone comes in with, knee pain or back pain, or they can't lift their shoulder up past a certain point, and sometimes in a session they feel significantly better, or at least you help them progress way faster. And I know at least, and some other people, you start to sort of expect that. And with a tendon, there is this understanding that they get less blood flow. It's a longer remodeling time. It does take longer. So we have to adjust our expectations. But at the same time, the direct current electric fields can influence the healing process. And of course, it's vitally important from a biomechanics, neuromuscular perspective, having proper muscle function all around the whole foot and ankle, well, that whole lower quarter is important for balancing loads on the Achilles too. So any hot spots, certainly in the gastroc, in the soleus, in the tibialis posterior, in the tibialis anterior, in the peroneals, any issues down there are super relevant, as are issues and dysfunctions up in the thigh and in the hip, and even core musculature, which is going to, if the hip is rotating or loading differently, of course that affects force through the foot, and vice versa. If the foot is excessively pronated or supinated, that creates these different torsional forces up the chain. So working on muscle function there, supporting the tissue healing, definitely can still be a big boost, but it's not always quite as much of an accelerator, because there is that underlying tissue healing process, and just, tendons do take longer to heal than other tissues. So I'm saying that as much for myself as for anyone else, because that's been one of my biggest things, is just having to be patient with that. And then each time I would play golf and have a little bit of a setback, I would, I'd have to deal with that and just continue on the same rehab. But also, one of the things I learned in that, speaking of the torsional force, I've been doing these isometrics at different angles. So I was doing, that's a good thing you mentioned too, the overcoming and versus, yielding isometrics we'll chat about. But I was doing overcoming isometrics. So I was just kind of pushing into a wall straight on. Like I was doing a calf raise trying to push through the wall. And then a colleague suggested doing them at different angles too, when we were talking about this torsional force in golf. So I would do them pressing in the side this way, and then pressing into the wall, into the side of the wall this way. So I was getting different force vectors through that ankle and through the Achilles. And that is something that was really helpful. It kind of helped me turn the corner, especially in relationship to handling the golf swing as well.
And I think that's so important too, because the average person that's not playing sports anymore lives their life front to back. Yeah. How many people are moving side to side? So we forget how much of an impact that has on our movement mechanics, is that ability to move side to side and activating those muscles on different force vectors, like you said.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for any population, not just sports and Achilles. But the other thing I think is important is, no matter what we do or what we try to do, we can't outpace our body's ability to heal. Like, certain tissues take a certain amount of time to heal. And I think that's super important to remember in anybody's recovery. I always got to remind that people when they have any type of tendon surgery, like especially a rotator cuff repair, like, it takes time for the tendon to heal, and you can only do so much to expedite that.
Yeah, for sure. So that's been a, humbling and just, good lesson through all this. I mean, you talk about how your low back issue, your L5S1 in PT school, was sort of your best learning experience. This for me was a big learning experience, going through a tendon injury of my own. So that was a great. I'm, as much as I don't wish, as much as part of me wishes it didn't happen, I'm glad it did, because it has been such a good learning experience. One other thing I want to mention that came from, I heard this Keith Barr, the researcher, I think he's at UC Davis, one of the UC schools, tendon researcher. One of the things that he talked about and has scientific articles about is a protocol that I've adopted, where he talks about having collagen and vitamin C, or I think he uses gelatin actually, but ultimately same thing. Having that 30 to 60 minutes before loading the tendon, so that it's in the blood, those amino acids and those compounds. And vitamin C, you mentioned it, Luke. Vitamin C is I think you'd call it a cofactor in the biochemical process of actually collagen synthesis. So having the raw materials, the amino acids, and vitamin C, this cofactor in the blood when you go to load the tendon during that short window when you actually are increasing blood flow to the tendon is valuable. So that's something that I've adopted too, and something that I would also encourage for tendon rehab.
I do have to, while you're saying that, give a shout out to my surgeon, Dr. Harston, because I feel like there's not a lot of orthopedic surgeons that are necessarily up to date on all of the supplementation that can go along with it, but he was very adamant about me making sure I was taking my vitamin C. He actually prescribed it post-operatively. So I thought it was interesting to have that come from the surgeon himself, because I feel like so many that I've worked with in the past have just been focused on the actual like mechanical aspects that they're fixing and not the underlying like physiology that's involved.
That's awesome. I know there were times when surgeons, and I think this is probably changed across the board now, but there were times when rehab was even an afterthought, thinking, oh, we did the surgery, the whole real work is done, everything else will take care of itself. I think all surgeons now understand the value of physical therapy, and then to go a step further and be thinking about that is awesome. That's great. So one other question for you about your experience: how much calf muscle atrophy did you have? Did you measure the circumference, gastroc, one side compared to the other?
I could probably go into our documentation system and pull it up, but there's a definite amount of atrophy. But so from my previous L5 S1 injury, it was left-sided. I still have calf atrophy on my left side from that. So just at baseline, my left calf is smaller than my right, but even after surgery, the atrophy made it to where the right side was, I think, at least a centimeter or two smaller.
Interesting. So so you had that atrophy. So that was not the side that ruptured. It was the other side, but it probably changed your mechanics in some ways over the years and all that. Okay.
Definitely become right side dominant. My left side is still like, if I do isolated unilateral work, my left side is still a little bit weaker. I have to work very hard to keep it baseline.
Okay.
Neutral.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite applications of the Neubie, really, is that reducing that atrophy and just all that inhibition from the trauma of, think about the trauma of injury. Surgery is even more traumatic, and the body doesn't know that it was a controlled trauma intentionally to help us. It just knows it was stabbed and torn into, and all this stuff happens. So that definitely shuts down around there. You get significant atrophy, of course, and that's something being able to help manage
and
that.
There's something that I really attribute the Neubie to expediting my recovery is the activation of my gastroc.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you exactly timeline of when it happened, but I remember the first time I fired my gastroc after surgery, because my soleus was strong enough to overcome most of what I needed early on. That it was when I had the Neubie on and I felt the gastroc fire, and then the neuromuscular connection clicked. I was like, okay, I can fire it now. So
Nice.
being able to re-establish that neuromuscular connection, the firing pattern, like you don't realize how much of a factor that plays into your rehab and recovery as well. It's like, if you don't know what it feels like to fire the muscle appropriately, then you can't really fire it. So once you feel it turning on, then you can kind of remember that and recreate it. So Neubie was definitely beneficial in getting that firing faster.
Yeah, I love that. Beautifully said there. Reflecting now, taking off your patient hat, putting back on your clinician hat, are there any biggest mistakes that stand out when you think of people going through similar recoveries to the one that you're experiencing right now? What do patients get wrong, or what are the things that delay the recovery timeline or impede the overall progress and result?
I think number one probably be nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a lower socioeconomic status when I'm treating my patients directly. And so with that usually comes poor nutrition. So, making sure that patients understand the importance of proper nutrition, because like we talked about earlier, like if you don't have the components that make up the tissues, you're gonna have to pull from somewhere else. Like your body needs those available. So it's kind of like the idea with the vitamin C of having it in the bloodstream, like especially with protein, but having extra protein isn't going to hurt in this scenario. Worst case, you're just going to pee it out. So, I think nutrition is one of the biggest factors. I think mindset is another big one, having that hope that you can overcome this and focusing on the positive. And I think the third is one that you've already touched on, is just realizing having an appropriate understanding of timelines, like knowing when things are supposed to happen, and that especially with tendons, you can't outpace the body's ability for that tendon to heal. Like I couldn't really get back to plyometrics before 4 months. I mean, I guess if I was Aaron Rodgers, I could have, but in general, like it took me about 4 months, and that's doing everything relatively as top of the line as you can do it. I wasn't fortunate enough to be able to take a Neubie home, but uh, maybe one day I'll have it at home too. But I think those are probably my three biggest takeaways for people when they first have a surgery is just understanding a realistic expectation of when things are supposed to happen, um, having proper nutrition, and having that proper mindset.
And I would segue on that, just piggybacking on what you said there about you versus Aaron Rodgers. So professional athletes are able to do hours per day of rehabilitation and have all the nutrition prepared for them and be able to emphasize sleep because this is their job. So if you're trying to fit this in around the stresses of a day job, that is just different than if recovering is your job, if you're getting paid to recover. So there's still a timeline there, but the body can devote, and the timeline is because there's a certain amount of resources the body can devote to that healing process. And at the professional athlete setting, they just have a greater percentage of those finite resources going towards that healing process. Whereas you or I, with a day job, we can't put 100%. Maybe it's 80% of our resources are going towards that. So maybe we heal 80% as fast. And I'm not saying the numbers are exact, but the premise is I think analogous.
I think you touched on one other thing that I probably didn't mention that I should have is sleep. So recovery, like making sure you're getting that recovery. Those first 2 months after surgery, sleep was probably one of my biggest priorities outside of my daily recovery, is making sure I allocated that. And I was actually taking naps during the day because I could to get that recovery. And I was taking probably an hour nap every day and sleeping close to 8 hours each night. Whereas normally I'm lucky if I can get 7 to 7.5, just based on how everything is. I wish I could get more. But having that allocated time for sleep and making that a huge priority, because that is when so much recovery happens. So not being overstimulated all the time and actually, making sleep one of the most important things.
Yeah. And there's stories of guys like Roger Federer, LeBron James, Michael Phelps will talk about sleeping 12 hours cumulatively between their night and naps when they're training as hard as they do. I mean, there's times where, that is a huge part of it. So those are, I think, at least we've touched on the big variables there. As we transition here, towards winding down the episode, I do want to make sure we touch on the topic of prevention. So we've already sort of talked about it when we talk about the causes of our respective injuries and other injuries and some of the mechanisms. Of course, the way to prevent it is to do the opposite. But I think it's worth spending a moment just to get clear on some of the biggest priorities. And I think the biggest way to frame it is this notion of load versus capacity. The injury happens when load exceeds the capacity. So how do you prevent injury? Well, you either reduce load or you increase the capacity. So, we talked about both. It's interesting that we both had that common thread of not being as recovered for different reasons there. So our capacity generally in the days of our respective injuries were down. But what jumps out to you, Luke, with the thinking you've done, the coaching of your patients as sort of the biggest pillars of preventing injuries like these?
Well, I think so much of my normal routine is based on staying strong and preventing injuries that it's always kind of on my forefront. I just had left out a body part. And so I think taking some of the general principles I've learned in my recovery and just including those into my rehab. So you did one the other day I saw on your Instagram where you did a split lunge with your rear foot elevated, but your front foot was in a plantar flex position. So you're doing that isometric core stabilization. So for me as the Achilles in general, I'm going to include a couple more isometrics into my programming and then some specific Achilles load-in. So just kind of build in that rehab into making some of those into more of a true strengthening exercise. So adding some external load as things get stronger and I can tolerate more load, and making sure that I do that consistently. So if I skip 2 weeks because of various reasons that I got to kind of back off, and build myself back up. I don't just go right back into that same load. So that I'm making sure I am cognizant of my load management in my normal routine.
Yeah.
That would probably be my biggest takeaway. And that's what I usually try to tell people, even if it's something as simple as a back injury. Like, hey, you fixed it, but your brain also has those neuromuscular pathways. You got to think about the motor control and motor learning. Yeah, we did this for 3 months, but you had your old routine for 3 years before this. We're not going to break that old motor learning pattern over 3 months. You're going to very easily fall back into your same patterns. So we have to retrain that. And it doesn't, once you get over the injury, you don't necessarily have to do it as much, but even 1-2 days a week, spending 20 minutes focusing on those areas of weakness that you typically have can do wonders for you.
Yeah. I think that's beautifully said. And I would just, I don't know, even not even elaborate, just perhaps say it a little differently, would say that we all, when we talk about load and capacity, our capacity is determined by many things, like you've talked about: recovery, nutrition, sleep, all that. So that is a huge part of it. And then in terms of movement and exercise, being able to understand that there's certain prerequisites of movement that we need. We need to be able to do fundamental movement patterns if we want to be able to exercise or play a sport. And if there's any deficits there is that regular, like you said, Luke, you were focused on preventing injury throughout your body, except for this one area that turned out to be the one that got injured. So being able to have that routine that you do, that I do, that's specific to us, that helps address those weak links and build up over time. Because we are a reflection of our habits. So if we have a good routine, like that thing that's really helped me a ton is just having a solid routine that I do 6 or 7 mornings a week, where I work on my hip and core stability. Helps me with I've got some low back history and issues with hip mobility that I just gradually kind of chipping away at by working on every day has helped a lot. And then one thing that I'm working in now is regular, several days a week, these Achilles isometrics. Keith Barr, also the researcher who I've referenced already, he talked about this issue, or this protocol that he did with rock climbers. Because in rock climbing, one of the most common injuries is the finger tendons. I did a podcast episode with Logan Cooper, who works a lot with climbers. Actually, we talked about this extensively too. I think it was episode in the 60s, something like that. But great episode. I highly recommend going back through the Undercurrent podcast archives. Find Logan Cooper. So he talked about that. So the tendons, of course, we have this system of tendons in the hand that go out to each knuckle, each layer of the finger. And those tendon injuries, so much force goes through there, and those end up being some of the worst injuries that climbers get. And so in Keith Barr, in the episode with Tim Ferriss, and he talks about this in his different protocols, he talks about doing these relatively low intensity isometrics. It was something like 30 seconds at a time, a few times over 10 minutes. So you're getting just a couple minutes of actual load, but it's not fatiguing because it's sub-maximal, and it's still a stimulus for tendon remodeling. So taking that on, working in some sort of ongoing tendon maintenance, tendon training, tendon resilience protocol is something that I certainly am doing and intend to continue doing, and I think would be a valuable recommendation.
It's kind of funny because I'm standing as I'm talking to you, and I'm kind of shifting my weight around, and what I'll do, and this is something that I actually try to incorporate with my patients, especially like being a dad, like when I'm playing with my kids, is turn everyday activities into rehab activities. So as I'm standing here, I'm kind of doing an Achilles isometric. So, I have my heel a centimeter off the ground. So building that into things that you're already doing in your life, like if you're playing with your kids on the floor, you can do bridges while you're playing with your kids and work on core stability or glute strength. So trying to work that progressive loading into your daily activity. So it's not just, hey, I've been sitting at a desk all day, now I'm going to go do a max workout. You can get up and do a couple things here and there. And like you said, a tendon, you really don't need that much cumulative load. But if you do a minute 5 times a day, that's 5 minutes of cumulative load on the tendon. That really helps with that stimulus.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's beautifully said. I think that's probably a good way to close the discussion on all things Achilles. So that was good. Is there any more before we close the show? Anything more, Luke, that you feel like we need to throw into the mix to complete the arc of this discussion?
No, I think we hit, all the major points.
All right, very good, very good. Then I'm going to ask you our closing question that I've adopted recently. So the question is, if you could shout one message from a rooftop or a mountaintop for everyone to hear, or put one message on a billboard for everyone to see, what would your message be?
I probably am biased in this answer, but I'm sure you know who Jocko Willink is.
Oh yeah, for sure.
His is discipline equals freedom. And I might have to steal that from him.
Yes, the somewhat counterintuitive understanding that having structure in many areas can actually create a greater sense of freedom overall.
And I think, I might steal that back. But now that I'm thinking about it, I might say is remember that we were hunter-gatherers. And so that our bodies, just like remember we're hunter-gatherers. So even though we don't live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle anymore, our bodies are still made to live in the wild. So if you can remember that all of our body processes are functioning to keep us alive when we're in a war or we're dealing with a lion chasing us, then you can really reframe your perspective on a lot of things.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm going to open back up the Achilles discussion because I think that's one of the big issues. If you look at how, our genetics are intended for, are built for that hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And if you look at the experience of activity and connective tissue generations ago, back in the hunter-gatherer days versus now, if you think about the amount of time spent in a squatting position and in different positions on the floor and things like that versus sitting in chairs, and you think about the amount of hours of activity in hunter-gatherer days, the average human was active for 30 hours a week. That's 30 times 60, 1,800 minutes a week. And now we talk about 150 minutes a week of exercise. It's literally more than a 10x difference. That's 150 minutes is like a recommendation for being healthy. So if you think about the amount of activity that our bodies are really designed and intended to handle in the different positions we're supposed to be in, which of course is mechanical stimulus on all the different connective tissues, I think that is a big part of the prevention strategy overall, is finding ways to be more active in our lifestyles, see different positions more often, sit on the floor instead of in chairs, get more steps, all that. I think that's brilliant, and it's super relevant to our discussion here. So I had to open it back up for a moment.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know if you've read this book, but it's probably one of the most foundational books for me for physical therapy that wasn't a physical therapy book. I'll give you a shout out. Your book was really good, and I was hesitant on that. I'll give you an A+ on your book, but A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life.
Oh,
I don't know if you've read. I got it right here. I'll give you.
Oh yeah. I
keep this one on my desk because I always reference it all the time.
Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. Okay, I'm going to get that one. Heather Haying.
Brett Weinstein and Heather Haying.
Brett Weinstein and Heather Haying. Okay, very good. So I was thinking you might mention a book called Move Your DNA by Katie Bowman, which
I haven't done that one.
Is a book that is similar along those lines, that looks at anthropology of how hunter-gatherers moved and how that compares to our lifestyle. Also, he talks, and Michael Easter talks about that a lot in The Comfort Crisis too. So a couple of good books, but yeah, I like that recommendation. I'm going to pick that one up.
Yeah, very good.
All right, great note on which to close. Luke, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, dear listener. Hopefully you got as much out of this episode as I did from the discussion with Luke Brohm, physical therapist, clinic director at Court Shepherdsville. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your favorite platform. We will see you on the next episode of the Undercurrent Podcast.